The Pacific Ocean. It takes up 30% of the surface of the globe, and when looking at it from space, it's so large that from certain angles, it's the only thing to view. There are islands in the South Pacific which are just thousands of miles away from any other landmass. And you know what? In my opinion, this is just wasted space. There's only so much room on Earth. Cities are overcrowded, and then there's this large portion of blankness. Who can live here? Fish? They got nothing going on. So here's an idea. What if in an alternate timeline, there was a landmass right here?
Cody, please tell me you're not going to use some crackpot theory from a pseudo-archaeologist to base this whole scenario off of.
This is the continent of Mu.
Oh god.
It was imagined by a 19th century archaeologist named Augustus Le Plongeon, and later drawn on a map by fellow Mu enthusiast James Churchward. Both of these guys and a few others really believed that the continent of Mu was once a real lost landmass. So, trust me, we're gonna get to the scenario, but I really want to talk about this first. Augustus Le Plongeon had dedicated himself to studying the pre-Columbian ruins of the Maya and piecing together the puzzle pieces of the past. And as was par for the course for most archaeology of the 1800s, he was just straight up wrong. You see, Plongeon was a big fan of the Freemasons, and it seems like the appeal of his secret fan club sometimes got in the way of, you know, archaeology. He started seeing Mason symbols everywhere in Mayan ruins, started theorizing about how certain dots in human history were really connected. Plongeon theorized that Mayan civilization was the first civilization in human history. All others had originated from it. Now, how did the ancestors of the Greeks, Egyptians, and basically any old world civilization get out of the Americas? By crossing from Atlantis, of course. This was the most tame part of the theory. You see, Plongeon deciphered Mayan script, or so he thought, to conclude that this ancient society had a global telegraphic network that connected it to every other civilization on Earth. The Mayans were also masters of the mystic and psychic arts. For this new, bold discovery, Plongeon and his wife were deemed pioneers of metaphysical archaeology by the Russian mystic Madame Blavatsky. Yes, there was the psychic babushka that had a cult-like following in the late 19th century, that's a whole other story. Plongeon, taking this blessing in stride, continued his research, which had largely been dismissed by actual archaeologists. After years of research, Plongeon finally came up with his master theory. 1. Some of the images on the wall looked like him. 2. The Mayans were descended from a lost and great civilization that once existed on the South American coast. This global empire was ruled by the great Queen Mu. Queen Mu had secret and arcane knowledge of Freemasonry that she passed on to ancient Egypt. Plongeon concluded that when Queen Mu died, her civilization split off from the Americas, literally. And then I guess the whole continent of Mu just sank into the ocean. The only evidence of its existence being scattered in Mayan ruins and maybe Polynesians, who knows. None of that really matters because the main point Plongeon really wanted to hit home is that Queen Mu has been reincarnated like thousands of times, until finally winding up as his underage wife. After Plongeon's death, his idea of Mu was carried on by certain pseudoscience enthusiasts, including James Churchward. Churchward built upon this whole Mu idea, drawing what the continent supposedly looked like, basically by connecting the dots of various Polynesian islands. Hey, that looks good. Churchward proposed that Mu was actually the origin of humanity and the Garden of Eden, home to a lost race called the Nazcals. The Nazcals colonized the entire world, and everything is basically the remnants of their fallen society. And there you go. That's why this landmass is shaped like that, and called Mu. If you hadn't gotten the hint by now, the continent of Mu is not a scientific theory. It was pretty much the accidental byproduct of a pseudo-scientific madman who imagined his creepily younger wife was the reincarnation of a mythical god queen. Even at the time, this was seen as an outlandish idea. Even if the theory of plate tectonics and knowledge of the ocean's crust weren't common knowledge at the time, you didn't need to be a scientist to think this was batshit stupid. Today, Mu largely exists as a meme, or as a basis for science fiction stories. It's an Atlantis without using Atlantis. And, I guess it's being used by me today, because despite the fact this continent never existed, nor ever had a decent reason for being imagined, it would be pretty neat if it did exist, right? What if this continent of Mu actually did exist? There is no ancient civilization or Nazcals or any of that other stuff, but it's just another landmass. The Earth simply had another piece of crust that existed above the water. Oh god, plate tectonics. First issue, the shape. This is just a big Papua New Guinea, there's no getting around that. There is a great group called AML Official who specify in imagining realistic continents that follow plate tectonics. I, however, didn't want to simply copy their homework. When I think of Mu, I have been accustomed to this shape, as flawed as it is. Let's ignore plate tectonics. Think of this like we just took the ocean crust floor and raised it up. That's not how a continental crust works, but it's a better basis than just straight up putting mountains wherever. When it comes to imagining such fantastical scenarios like this, at some points, I really do just have to fill in the blanks. I mean, all of these videos at the end of the day are fiction, but I do try my best to explain my reasoning for why something happens in a scenario. It's never just random. But sometimes, you know, for the sake of the video, I have to wing it. The only thing that's important is that this shape exists and the mountains are roughly around here. With the breakup of Pangaea, Mu was just one of the landmasses that were attached to Gondwana, the southern continent. Now I say this because I can imagine this landmass breaking off of Australasia more so than breaking off of South and North America, just by the nature of how the continents move. Because of this, Mu's megafauna would be similar to other southern hemisphere continents, home to megafauna marsupials, giant birds. Now, as interesting as megafauna are, where they live and how they evolve entirely depends on their environment, which leads to the question, what type of climate and ecosystems would even exist on Mu? Because we are placing a massive continent in the middle of the Pacific, ocean currents are going to be drastically affected, which has major ramifications, but in the meantime, we only care about Mu. Now, I had to take some liberties, but for the most part, I came up with this map. You can debate which climate goes where and to be more specific, but to keep things simple, the south is much drier thanks to that cold ocean current. The north, east, and west would be constantly facing rainstorms and have warm, humid environments. In fact, Mu is pretty unique as a continent in just how generally uniform its climate would be. Considering Mu is largely horizontal, on the equator, the only other comparison I could really make is Europe, which, thanks to its shape, it's pretty uniform in climate throughout, at least compared to continents like Africa and the Americas, who are largely vertical and very wildly in climate. With all of that squared away, when would people actually show up? Oceania was the last region on Earth that was settled by humans, so it's no surprise that Mu would be the last continent that's fully settled as well. Yet even so, there would be some parts of this landmass that, simply due to size, would have a longer history with humans than others. Mu is so large that it would span 3 regions of Oceania. In our history, the distance between these regions was so great that there were periods between migrations. Now, whether it would be from the south or landing on the western peninsula, humans wouldn't arrive on Mu until 1500 BC, while Polynesians of our own timeline had periods of discovering islands, settling them, and then going off to colonize new lands. In this alternate timeline, their settlement and culture would be radically different, considering they'd be the sole culture group on a previously unsettled continent. This would be a discovery and transformation of a landmass not seen until the Americas would be settled millennia later, which doesn't really bode well for the megafauna of Mu that had been previously undisturbed for millions of years. Humans, regardless of culture, seem to have a habit of extincting wildlife that wasn't adapted to fear us. Sadly, as fascinating as these giant beasts of Mu probably would have been, it's very possible that in our alternate world, future humans would learn of them much as we do today, through their fossils, missing them by only a few millennia. While seafaring doesn't play as crucial of a role in deep-sea exploration, it does play a role in close coast navigation, and very importantly, trade. From the time of the ancient Greeks onward, another civilization in the Far East would be growing in the Pacific. People first settling on the westernmost coasts of Mu, a land of dense rainforest and mountainous valleys. While 1500 BC seems short compared to other parts of the world, it's still a long enough time for cultures to dissipate, evolve, and split from one another. Polynesian culture would be more different from one another than in our own timeline, because of all the time and distance it would take to actually settle this landmass. The best example of this is simply this peninsula. I can see this being prime real estate for the first major center of an alternate Polynesian civilization. It could also be incredibly diverse, thanks to a range of valleys and mountains that would divide this land up, much like Japan. Eventually, perhaps this peninsula may unite thanks to its similar geography and climate, but for much of its history, it will be divided with individual valleys forming their own city-states. This peninsula would be very lucky due to its location smack dab in the center of a trade triangle. The islands of the South Pacific would act as a highway from one end to the other, creating a new opportunity for trade between East Asia, Indonesia, Australian Aboriginals, and the Polynesian coast. One reason I really wanted to make this video in the first place is I found it just fascinating how this continent would create an alternate trade triangle. In our timeline, there was very little trade between Polynesians and East Asian civilizations, mostly thanks to the vast distance between the two, and also because migration was a largely generational thing between islands. In many ways, this part of the Pacific kinda turns into an eastern version of the Mediterranean. The waters wouldn't be as calm, of course, but the more enclosed sea leads to a series of coastal trade routes. Eventually, a trader will hit some form of land, perhaps whatever this alternate civilization may be, either city-states or a vast empire, would be the last leg of an alternate Silk Road. There never would be an empire that spans most of Mu, of course, or even one that spans most of the west coast, simply due to its size. This coast is one of the most well-populated places on Earth. Think of it like Mu's equivalent of the Mediterranean, the Yellow River, or Mesoamerica. Or if there's some alternate river valley, a civilization sprouting up from there. I'd imagine just like how Eurasia had steppes and North America had the prairies, this flatter and drier center of the continent creates a culture of Polynesian descendant nomads, ones that are disconnected from their oceanic origins and have taken to living in warm savannas. Without horses, these wouldn't be the fast horsemen that could plunder cities. They'd probably resemble bushmen of Australia and Central Africa. The further east we would go, the newer the settlements would become, as it still takes generations for people to migrate into new lands. Easter Island in our timeline wasn't discovered until the 800s, and it's very likely with a whole continent taking up space in this alternate world, there's a lot closer land to settle. Either way, population is far more permanent in the west than it is in the east. While coastal desert settlements may exist in the south, this is by far the least populated part of the continent. But it's still interesting to imagine Polynesian descendant desert people. Oftentimes, whenever I imagine these alternate geography videos, I can't really go into that much depth when it comes to, say, whatever the nation's names would be, or where the borders are. I mean, I could, but then it'd just be me listing off a bunch of fictional Polynesian-inspired nations that I just made up. I like to focus more on greater trends that aren't simply historical fanfiction. And there are no greater trends in this scenario than trade and, well, colonization. We've already discussed trade in the West, but what about trade in the East? As you see, Mu existing creates another cycle of currents right off of the coast of the Americas. While fewer Polynesian explorers perhaps venture east, those that do would encounter Mesoamerican civilizations and empires to to trade and exchange with. It's debated how much Polynesians and Native Americans had contact in our timeline. We know there's evidence of at least some contact, but never an extensive route that influenced both sides. It's been established that even with small islands to jump off of, Polynesians still probably made the trip to contact the Inca. If there was a massive continent in the Pacific, this brief contact would evolve into an extensive trade network. This would be a cultural exchange between the people that traveled the furthest east and the people that existed the furthest west. I mean, it's all relative, but you know what I mean. By the way this changes ocean currents, it creates a natural waterway to travel to Mu, up the coast, and onto the Americas. In some ways, Mu becomes the final connecting point in the global trade network, a bridge between Asia and the Americas. And because Mu is so large, it would have two distinct regions, one more influenced by East Asia, and the other influenced by Native American civilizations. Now, I'm not saying that there would be Native American civilizations on Mu, or that they would blend together, but traits might be transferred, as they always do, through trade. You know, things like religious ideas, writing styles, borrowed words, weapons, and perhaps even animals and plants. If I wanted to go far enough, I could imagine that this trade would be the saving grace for the New World, in context of what is to come. In our timeline, the Polynesians largely were isolated from the rest of the world thanks to that vast ocean. There was no trade with China or anywhere else, yet with Mu, they'd be in contact with East Asia and East Asian diseases. Mu could be subject to pandemics of the Old World, and over time, Polynesians might grow a resistance to diseases that they didn't otherwise in our own history. By the nature of contact and the gradual trade that would happen throughout the continent, this means that Polynesian traders in the eastern portion of the continent would introduce Old World diseases first to the Americas. Because they wouldn't be destabilizing any institutions and would be gradually over time, the natives of America could perhaps grow a better resistance than they did in our own timeline. When eventually Europeans do arrive to the New World, perhaps the Aztec, if they still existed, wouldn't easily fall to a plague, because their population would have grown to tolerate the same diseases that the Europeans had, thanks to centuries of trade with Mu. The Americas wouldn't really be some new world left isolated. Columbus's voyage, if anything, would just be the last link in a trade network that for centuries had already spanned the globe. And Europe would be the furthest west that finally linked up with it. Which brings us to, well, I guess the thing I really didn't want to predict, but it's kind of inevitable: colonization. So before we get to this, let's talk about how Mu existing would change everything you would ever know. So here's the thing, you can't have a continent that is this big exist and not butterfly so many things out of existence. Just for one, the sea level. We are taking the Pacific Ocean, the largest body of water on Earth, and placing a massive new continental shelf on it. This displaces an incredibly, inconceivably large amount of water. That water has to go somewhere else, and where it goes is up. Sea levels would dramatically be higher if this continent existed, simply due to how much space it would take up. What that means is that all of human history, civilizations being on the coast, just scrap them. None of them exist, at least as we would know them. While it would be cool to imagine ancient China trading with the Mu, coastal China as we would know it would be underwater. In fact, every major center of civilization would be. Any new state that does arise in this alternate Mu world would be tens of kilometers inland compared to our own. Simply put, for the most part, it just butterflies everything. There are two pretty unsatisfactory endings to this. First, by any realistic standard, Mu existing creates a world that is alien to what we know. That in itself is a pretty general way to end the video. It's kind of a cop-out, but on the other hand, if we ignore science and just hand-wave everything away, saying that Mu doesn't affect the world as we know it, and human history goes for the most part like we're familiar with, then there's eventually just the rise of Western colonialism. Because if Mu doesn't affect the rest of history, then this happens anyway. It's a wall that always happens to be hit. So, even though it's unrealistic, for the sake of finishing this scenario off, let's talk about it. The colonization of the Pacific consisted of every nation just taking islands here or there. So let's say European explorers come upon Mu. How does this happen? There'd be two possibilities in how they would do so, both Portuguese, both around the same time. Either by Magellan sailing from South America and landing on the easternmost peninsula, or by the Portuguese who had trading in the East Indies, hearing of some large landmass by the locals and venturing eastward to land on the west coast themselves. If I could guess, it would probably be both. Like a pincer movement. Both sides of Mu explored by the Portuguese in the 1500s, or at least the outer coasts being discovered, Australia style. Poor Portugal, however, as while they be the first to find this even newer world, they, by agreement with the church, couldn't claim it, as this land legally fell into Spanish territory. You know, considering if you're a Catholic and you held this legal document by the Pope in high regard. And while the Protestant world sure didn't, they wouldn't get there first. The Spanish would love Mu, or at least the northern coast, as the northern coast would be the perfect highway from Spanish America to the Spanish Philippines, a dotting line of bases and naval yards, alternate Spanish cities across the coast. While it's still possible that Mu isn't depopulated due to epidemics, it's still very likely the natives cede territory or grant land permission for the Spanish to colonize parts of the coast, probably by force. Eventually, over time, just like the two territories surrounding it, the northern portion of Mu becomes largely Spanish-speaking Polynesian people, maybe even creating the birth of new cities and mixed cultures, just like in every place Spain pretty much colonized. If you know Spanish history, you know what's going on here. Now also keep in mind, there's still the idea of a lost city of gold and other myths that spurred early exploration. Mu finds itself under the same scrutiny as Mesoamerica did in our timeline. Whether or not the Spanish do find gold, I can't say, yet I would imagine there are probably some other valuable elements that they would eventually discover. Spain could never hold all of Mu though, only mainly the northern coast, and simply due to it being a highway. This would be regarded as a part of the Spanish-speaking world, this strip of northern Mu, and maybe the western peninsula included. Spain could never hold it forever. The Dutch are the next contenders, probably setting up shop on the non-Spanish west coast. This region just becomes an expansion of the Dutch East Indies, valuable real estate in the East Asian trade. If the British, French, and hey, maybe Germans tried to take territory, they'd be left with kind of the scraps, the undesirable portions of the continent, such as the drier south and colder southeast. Areas that aren't really close to anything and aren't really going anywhere else. It wouldn't be until the Industrial Revolution where any attempt is made to go deeper into Mu. This continent would remain as mysterious to Europeans as Central Africa was before the 19th century. Keep in mind, this is still a landscape of savannas, rainforest, and dense jungle. The desert regions would have small strips of temperate coast that could perhaps be the perfect place for British colonies. Think of this area maybe being the third part of a British oceanic triangle. If we wanted to bring the United States into this, then Spanish Mu becomes front and center at any territorial expansion the Americans plan to do, whether it be in a surprisingly similar Spanish-American War or just as a series of excursions to take it. Mu for the Americans becomes another portion of manifest destiny, maybe being seen as the next step to take such a large portion of the Pacific. It may even be a refuge for religious and political dissidents of the Americas. The Mormons settled in the interior, attempting to convert the natives. Mu Polynesia by the turn of the 20th century, following this path that Mu existing doesn't change anything by the way, results in the continent following a similar position as the rest of the world, dominated by empire until the empire's collapse and decolonization occurs. And I mean, decolonization did happen after World War II, so if World War II somehow still happened, I would imagine the Japanese would try to take this peninsula, and the Americans and Japanese would fight over this coast. It would probably change the dynamic of the entire Pacific War, as instead of island hopping, it would be kind of coast hopping. with the Japanese retreating even deeper and deeper into the continent. Not that it would probably change that much about the outcome of the war. By the end of this long, extensive alternate history, Polynesia, while once home to empires, city-states, and simply vast tribal networks, becomes divided along centuries of cultural shifting and colonization. The tribes and cultures that changed the least, ironically, would be those that originally inhabited the places farthest from the sea. Kinda poetically, those that kept their cultural roots would be the ones farthest from it. So, yep, I knew people would complain if I didn't include that whole tidbit, so. If Mu did exist, of course we never could truly know what this would result in. Yet I do like to imagine that for at least a time, had Mu existed, it would lead to a series of trade and connectivity between parts of the world that in our timeline rarely, if ever, interacted. Just by changing our geography, we change history. And I really like looking at this map and imagining what complex network it could have spawned. So in the end, thanks Churchward, and every crazy person that ever believed in Mu. Your theories were insane and made no sense whatsoever, but it sure did make for a fun thought experiment. You know, Churchward believed that Mu sunk beneath the waves. In his book, The Lost Continent of Mu, Churchward says the civilization and landmass was thriving until dangerous hackers brought down the security of Mu's global spanning psychic connection, which is why Mu needed NordVPN. Oh no, not again. That's right, Jimmy. This was a sponsor the entire time. Can you please stop including me in these ad reads? I have a life outside of this, you know. I have a family. You see, Jimmy, Mu might not have been able to escape the cold depths of the Pacific Ocean, but you can escape from having your information online being uncovered by insidious ne'er-do-wells. Even though these sponsor reads are in the style of an 80s infomercial, I've had NordVPN since time began. I use it for any activity online, not simply using its next-generation encryption to keep my information safe, but also to bypass firewalls and hop across the globe to explore the other side of the region lock. Speaking of those ne'er-do-wells, they're going to have to try harder with NordVPN's brand new threat protection. Threat protection is additional security to prevent you from running into any malicious sites, and it doesn't even require a virtual private network to work. You can choose to just have it working regardless if you're using the NordVPN app itself, which means you won't need to do anything to figure out if you're downloading something that could hurt your device. Threat protection just immediately notifies and denies it from going further. It also blocks those pesky pop-up ads that could change your life in an entirely different way. They have VPN servers all over the place. They don't pick them up, they just leave them everywhere. 5,400 plus servers in 59 countries. Why do they keep dropping these things? And at the same time, Nord doesn't collect any of your information while doing so. You're boring. With peer-to-peer everywhere and worldwide access, you can share large files privately and securely. But it isn't simply sharing between two people that matters. No, you can share NordVPN itself with up to 6 devices at once. And the way to get on it is just by clicking. It's easy, even Jimmy can do it. I'm done. I'm sick of being included in these. They're getting worse. So if you want to Japanese Netflix, click on the link in the description to get a 2-year plan at a massive discount, plus 1 additional month for free by going to nordvpn.com/althist. Okay, bye forever. Jimmy, don't open that door. I didn't activate threat protection. Why are you people dressed as robbers?
No, stop.
Ah! Jimmy, you have to run from those insidious ne'er-do-wells. They want your online information.
I'm getting bludgeoned by generic-looking robbers. I can't run.
They want your IP address, Jimmy. They want to dox you.
They are physically abusing my body. There is no computer in the situation at all.
You should have used threat protection, Jimmy.
I'm outside of your sponsor. Why is reality itself now a NordVPN ad?
It's not a NordVPN ad, Jimmy. It's a NordVPN integration. NordVPN.com/althist.